It is official. In a second ballot vote, Pam Bellegarde won to stay on as the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations.
Better housing, better education, better health care, and yes, lands and resources coming back to First Nations people, because we know it's assumed Crown sovereignty. We know it's assumed Crown jurisdiction, and we're going to get that back in our rightful place in this land.
Joining us from Vancouver this morning is the Chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University, Pam Palmater. Good to have you with us this morning, Pam.
Thanks for having me.
We heard a very strong speech from Mr. Bellegarde, including quotes to move beyond residential schools, assert ourselves as nations. What will his mandate be in this term?
Well, the mandate comes from the chiefs, generally from resolutions that are on the floor, and they cover a wide range of areas. Generally, the focus, though, is advocating on asserting our rights and then defending those rights as against federal and provincial territorial laws and policies. However, the AFN's kind of morphed in recent years, more away from the advocacy, and it seems to be engaged more directly in the negotiation part of things, which is generally where the controversy tends to creep in, and the criticism from the chiefs.
Talk to me more about the criticism from the chiefs for Mr. Bellegarde, because that is one of the main issues of his leadership going forward. There were accusations he was too close to the Liberal government and not standing up necessarily for First Nations rights, but more involved in the negotiations, as you say.
Well, and that's the thing. So you've essentially covered it. What chiefs generally tend to want is the AFN to be a very strong advocacy organization and support organization for the First Nations across the country. Essentially, they're supposed to be the front line in the defense of our rights. It's good when the AFN folks can have a strong working relationship with the federal government if and when that's suitable. But when our rights are under threat, then it should take more of a protective role. And I think what we haven't seen is the protective role. You don't see AFN at Camp Cloud in BC, which is protesting the pipeline going through their First Nation, or at the Justice for Our Stolen Children protests in Saskatchewan, or a whole host of them across the country. And that's really where the disconnect is.
You mentioned the issue of the pipeline. That was a big divide on the floor between the chiefs who had votes in BC and the rest of the country, those for it, those against it. Where does Mr. Bellegarde stand?
Well, Mr. Bellegarde has said publicly that he has, supported pipelines and similar kinds of energy projects. He's had, energy conferences. He does a lot of work and meetings with those in the energy industry. So it's very clear where he stands on that side of things. That has caused a significant divide and ultimately the creation of what's called the Treaty Alliance, which is an alliance between many First Nations and even tribal governments in the United States who are opposed to development on Indigenous territories without First Nation consent. And that essentially means that some First Nations might be okay with it, but many are not. And no is supposed to mean no under both Canadian and international law.
Some of the talk on the floor was also changes that might need to be made to the Assembly of First Nations framework. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that's been called for and talked about for well over a decade. The fact that the AFN has very problematic election rules, which essentially give certain regions like BC an unfair advantage in elections, because you can have BC First Nations with very few band members that have the exact same voting rights as a community like Six Nations, which has 27,000 band members. And so what many of the chiefs have long called for is some kind of election rules which evens out the distribution of the vote so that it's relatively even, say, according to population. The other thing is really the AFN charter. We've seen in recent years AFN really overstepping their authorities under the charter, because the national chief has no inherent political authority, yet they sign on to political memorandums of agreements and they support federal agendas and things like that, And those are the kinds of rights that come from First Nations. And so they want some protections within that AFN charter that keeps AFN out of the rights and title business and stay securely within just the advocacy side of things.
Pam, good to have you with us on the day after the vote. Thanks for joining us from Vancouver.
Thank you.